Always love catching up with my guy, Graham Couch, Lansing State Journal. And Graham, let's just get right to it. To fall out from the Michigan melee, what can you tell us about what we know, and what have you made about Michigan State's response?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, it was beyond inexcusable, right? You can't do that. I mean, there are lots of factors that went into why something like that might happen, including the temperature of that rivalry, which is ugly and unhealthy, and frankly could probably use a break. Probably shouldn't be a protected rivalry for a while. It's reached that sort of place, but and that's really outside as much as anything. The fan base is the hatred for each other and the vitriol on social media and just where that is. But in terms of what it means for Michigan State football moving forward, could be without a couple starters. I think the most consequential guy who's suspended is Angelo Gross, a safety, or nickelback, for them. And so we'll see if there might, more videos come out. There may be another suspension or two before uh, the game, and so we'll see whether if whether that are any more key players. I think the real question for Michigan State is like, how you sort of rally from that in a week's time, get focused, and play a really good opponent. And they've shown some improvement in certain ways in recent weeks, but they're just not a team that's shown that they have it. That they have, what Illinois showed, like going down to Nebraska in a game, everybody was picking Nebraska with a +7.5 and all that stuff, and making that a popular bet. And Illinois goes down and very business-like, just a better team, a more disciplined team, a more seasoned-looking team. Like MSU doesn't have all those, doesn't have those things working for it right now.
Well, Michigan State, I think most expected them to regress a little bit from last year. But what has gone so wrong on the field this season to be 1-4 in the Big Ten, Graham?
Yeah, it's buyer beware in year 2 for year 3 for Illinois fans of the Brett Bielema era. Because there are some differences in terms of what's going on. A lot of what happened last year was they obviously had Kenneth Walker, who's had been incredible in the NFL of late, and you can kind of see the impact he had as a transfer. And they also had a more seasoned offensive line, and those are the two biggest differences between last year. And the offensive line has really struggled at times, and they knew that was a potential problem. They also defensively for a while had some injuries that I don't think they were running a scheme that worked for them early on, and they also had some injuries that turned out to be incredibly debilitating. And I thought their depth might be a little bit better there, but when they lost Darius Snow, Xavier Henderson, and Jacob Slade, as they're all Big Ten defensive tackle, two safeties and two key guys in the back end. And Darius Snow was going to play more of a hybrid linebacker type deal. But anyway, they couldn't. They just, without those guys, they were lost. They were in big trouble. And Jaden Reed then was hurt too on offense, and so they had guys hurt in places they just don't have the depth to afford it. And that was a big part, because as soon as Henderson and Slade came back, they beat Wisconsin, and they looked okay against Michigan at times. So there have been definite improvements on the defense just there. Like they're not 3-5 if those guys don't get hurt. They beat somebody along the way. I don't know if it's Maryland or the Minnesota game looks a little different, whatever it might be. But the other thing is, this is just sort of what they were last year, was a team that maximized everything they could be. And this year they have not. And there are reasons for, in the rebuild, they are where they are. This is like Mel Tucker's first recruiting class are true freshmen right now. So you could argue that somebody like when did Bielema get the job?
2020. Yeah.
But in November, December 2020?
Yeah. So his first full recruiting class is just in now. Yeah.
Right. So Bielema and Tucker are in the same boat, because Tucker comes in February. So he's got D'Antonio's 2020 class, and which was a really weak class that's starting to permeate the program. That's a problem. And then you wind up in 2020, the next class is what he calls his Zoom babies, all on. So his first class, he gets the job. A month later, COVID hits. and his first class is sort of done on Zoom. It's okay. There's some decent kids in there, but it's not really a real recruiting class. And so his first real recruiting class is this year. This next year is a really important year. But for MSU fans, they're going to have to be patient because I really don't think it's fair to judge the talent in the program. Now, it's fair to judge how they coach and maximizing who you are and looking competent on the field. But in terms of rising the talent level, you're probably looking at 2025 before it's fair to say, hey, that's how that should look. They should compete with Ohio State. They should compete with Michigan. So a lot of it's just the realities of the talent permeating the program, that you can't fix everything through the transfer portal. And sometimes you hit with those guys, sometimes you don't. But then the Kenneth Walker factor last year, without Kenneth Walker last year, they're probably a 5 or 6 win team, and they won 10 and then 11 with the bowl win. So that they're not that much different than last year. They just don't have him, but they also, I would argue, their offensive line is substantially worse.
From the outside, you have a year like this, and I think everyone was, whoa, that 10-year contract to Mel Tucker. You said the word that I think most people around Michigan State knew is there was a little bit of a rebuild here, and this was going to be a long-term thing. So what do you think? The 10-year contract with Mel Tucker, where this program's trajectory is, what the timeline of this so-called rebuild is?
Yeah, and I think there are 2 tracks, right? There's a here and now. They're with what they're doing today, and which isn't, things haven't gone that well. And then there's the what they're trying to become, and you don't want the track that's here and now to mess with the recruiting, to mess with other things, and it has to some degree already. I mean, they had 12 4-star kids in the class pretty early. They've lost about 3 of them, and they're recruiting at a level that they're up against people who are trying to flip you constantly. And their class isn't that big right now. I mean, it's really mostly 4-star kids, but they're only about 12 people in the whole class. So it'll be interesting to see how he rounds that out. They have not settled for a lot of guys, so that's interesting. So the timeline to me is the year that his first class, which are true freshmen right now, are redshirt juniors and seniors, and he's now had 3 classes that ought to be to some degree in the playing group. That's the first year that's a judgment year. And that's what they were paying for initially. Now, I don't think they were hoping things would look like this. They haven't looked. There's a lot of reasons not to be confident in what transpired this year. So I think all that criticism is fair, and he is making a lot of money, but he's being paid. He was paid for 2 reasons, largely paid to avoid regret. Like Matt Ishbia and Steve St. Andre, the 2 boosters. By the way, the school is not paying most of that extra money. That's paid by 2 boosters. And the school gave him a slight raise, but it's no more money than they would be paying the next coach, or it's the market value. What the school is paying him is not the top of the Big Ten, and it's less than what James Franklin's making. It's less, it's not that absurd. The total contracts, you can argue all coaching contracts are absurd, and it's pretty large, but they were paying not to have what happened to them with Nick Saban happen again. Matt Ishbia, who's one of those 2 donors, was a walk-on Michigan State's basketball program when that went down with Saban back in '99. And Izzo still regrets that Michigan State was on a road trip at North Carolina the night it happened between the school president and Saban. Thinks he and Saban were really close, thinks he could have prevented it. Like, there's all sorts of PTSD that goes on with Michigan State fans in that moment. The other thing is, I would argue that they should be grateful they did it. Because think about this. Think if they hadn't paid for Tucker. And I don't know how much was real about interest. I don't know that LSU was interested. I don't know who was. His agent may have, worked a couple reporters and gotten that to, get into a situation where MSU felt like they had to react. But if he had gone somewhere else, some other poor sap would be the head coach right now with this same roster, probably losing. And everybody would think that Mel Tucker was like, God's gift of football, and he was at some other school, and the new guy would have no chance. So at least now you have the guy who, you look like you struck gold with, and certainly you have a guy who's, I think, it has to be accountable for that contract, for the build. And are there a lot of people who are doubting it right now? Are there a lot of people think his staff's going to need some turnover? Yeah, absolutely, and maybe it will. But it's certainly it's a fascinating time, because they're going to be worse next year than this year, I think. Like, people are the patience it's going to take. Like, their offensive line isn't very good, but they lose a lot of them this year, and the guys coming in behind them don't seem like they're ready to play now. So why are they going to be okay next year? Maybe they'll be better in certain spots as teams change every year to year. but I don't see them being significantly different.
So on the field this year, Peyton Thorne and Jaden Reed was a fun combination last year. You said Jaden Reed getting back healthy now. That's certainly a passing attack that certainly seems like it'd still be dangerous. We know Daniel Barker is on the other side. Interesting dilemma there is Illinois is having a really good season. Yeah. Michigan State is not. They have some transfer running backs, but the running game without Kenneth Walker's has taken a step back. So you said you've seen some growth. Like, what have you seen offensively out of Michigan State? The offensive line notwithstanding.
Yeah, I mean, where Michigan State has an advantage some weeks and should most weeks is their playmakers on the outside, their tight ends. Daniel Barker's part of that. He's had some good games, some big moments. They got another kid named Malik Carr, is probably a prototypical NFL kid, who's probably at least another year away. And people thought he was going to have a better year this year. And they got one other tight end is pretty good, but really Carr and Barker are the two guys who can create some problems for defenses. And then you have Keon Coleman and Jaden Reed, especially at receiver. And Coleman is an NFL guy. He's only a sophomore, but he's, a 6'4", 200-pound receiver who's, he had 4 catches for 104 yards in the first half against Michigan, including 2 balls that he went up and got and won the touchdown. He is a guy that you can see the trajectory. But when they didn't have Jaden Reed at Washington early, and Keon Coleman made some big plays, but he's still not ready to be the guy. Like, he made some important plays. Like, he wasn't always in the right place. He's not a guy that there's not quite that chemistry. He is a number 2 right now. He's very effective. I think one of the things people are real frustrated with is in the first half against Michigan, Michigan was loaded up on Jaden Reed, and Coleman had single coverage, and they took advantage of that. And the second half, they didn't do anything, and they didn't find a way to get those guys the ball. And but together, I mean, Jaden Reed against Wisconsin had like 9 catches for 117 yards, including the game-winning 50-50 ball in overtime, threw a touchdown pass in overtime, and returned a punt 80 yards for a touchdown that was called back on for a penalty. But nonetheless, like just all the makings of a playmaker and a star in any game. And so that's where they can step out and separate themselves. And if the line holds up to an adequate level, which is 50-50, then they can cause some problems for you. But they can't run the ball consistently. Their backs are okay, but they don't have the line to do it.
The defense has really struggled this season for the most part, Graham. What are the issues there? And they always seem to have some talent, and they brought in some transfers, I know. So just what do you think of the defense so far?
Yeah, I mean, it would have been interesting to replay it if they don't get the injuries right away to the guys that got hurt, because it did change. Like, in hindsight, the idea they would win at Washington without all those guys is sort of ridiculous now. You're seeing now when they've gone to more of a 4-3 and they moved Jacoby Windman to linebacker, and certainly we'll see. Right now he's a guy who's playing in this game. He's a guy whose number pops up in the videos. I don't know how culpable he is. I don't know whether anything will come of that, but they're okay right now. I mean, they gave Wisconsin trouble. They held Michigan to 5 field goals. One of Michigan's 2 touchdowns was off, a punt that went awry because they got their backup long snapper, and they're another issue that Michigan State's having right now. And that created an 8-yard short field for Michigan. But really, that game was 22 points given up, even though they ran for a lot of yards. The defense has sort of found itself a little bit, and I don't think they're not like the identity of the team. They're not like, oh my God, you're facing Michigan State's defense. But they're not the sieve that they were a few weeks ago. And Slade up front makes a big difference. And I think being in the 4-3 helps. But just how much that trickle down to the other linemen is, and their depth there, which I thought at the beginning of the year would be the strength of the team, is the interior defensive line. And you're starting to see that a little bit. And Michigan's a team that can run on everybody. But Michigan didn't have the 60, 70, 80-yard runs they've had against other people against Michigan State. It was a pretty decent effort in certain ways.
So, Graham, what do you expect on Saturday, given everything going on? The defensive guys who will be out. We'll see who else, if anybody else is out. Against the Illinois team, as you said, they're locked in, man. Like, it's been a really impressive coaching job here. Really well-rounded team. So what do you expect from Michigan State on Saturday?
It's a good question. I don't know. I think Michigan State does have some good leaderships at key places. Like Xavier Henderson I can't even describe the impact of his absence. I mean, he's their safety. He knows everything. He calls out. His pre-snap communication is everything. So for a while, they've got young players and transfers back there at a key position, but also in the locker room and others. Like they've got some guys who will care, who are veterans, who will try to keep this thing focused. I don't know exactly everybody they'll be missing. But the real key to me, I think the defense, even if they're missing some guys, is found itself enough to hang in there. What I wonder is, can Michigan State's offense find itself enough to put pressure on Illinois? Like, you know, Michigan State offensively has not scored. They scored 34 against Wisconsin, but 13 of those are in overtime. So they haven't scored more than 3 touchdowns. They haven't gotten above the 21 mark since like Akron. Well, maybe I guess they had more than that against Washington late. They scored, but really it was that offense that I thought was going to threaten people. You know, they got 7 points. They have 2 70-yard drives in the first half against Michigan. One results in a touchdown, one a failed 4th down. But otherwise, they don't do anything. They had 21 against Wisconsin. You know, very little against Ohio State, and same for, I mean, almost Maryland. They had like 13. They really struggled in the second half to get anything consistently going, and the whole team was just awful against Minnesota. One of the worst games I've ever seen a Michigan State football team play. So, what I don't know is, like, do I think the defense is okay enough to keep this respectable? Yeah, but that only works if your offense can get into the mid-20s and put some pressure on somebody and can put some drives together and have big plays. And they have some capability for it, but if they don't win up front to some degree, then it's probably a double-digit loss.
Graham Couch, I want to leave you with this. You've covered Tom Izzo for such a long time. Where are we at in the Tom Izzo? Like, what chapter is this? Like, what would you title this chapter of Tom Izzo's part of his career?
Yeah, I don't know what your FCC language thing is on this podcast, but some people would call this his FU tour. You know, he is out there in a year of a transfer portal saying, I like my guys. We're going to build them. We're not going to do that. He's out there in the age of a lot of things changing, saying this is the way I do it, and we're going to see if it works. And we'll see. I don't know. He's rolled up his sleeves before, and, you know, his recruiting class coming in a year from now is pretty dang good. And that's he is, you know, people, when things weren't going great, people kept comparing him to D'Antonio, which I didn't think was fair, because, I mean, D'Antonio and that crew ran out of steam. That staff did. Izzo is way too ornery and fired up in life to ever. I mean, he's not going to keep doing that when he's out of steam. You're going to get frustrated, but this last year showed he can still, when he zeroes in on a class, go get it. And I think that was that was an important thing people needed to see. Now, they have a roster. They have a roster this year that I find really interesting. Be fun to watch. I don't know how great they'll be. I think they'll be good in the backcourt. They could be really good offensively. They might struggle. You know, they may not have a 5 that can deal with certain centers, but they'll be interesting. And if the right guys stick around, then the year after that could be really, really good again. But I don't think he's done. I would argue that you're probably looking, I mean, because he doesn't know what else to do. Like, he's not somebody who has a plan B. You know, he doesn't like want to go fish or golf, or this is what he does. And I would not be surprised if he's doing it 5 years from now.
Also, Grant, can I get your outside perspective? You cover the league so well. What do you make of what's going on in Illinois right now with football and basketball both being good?
Yeah, it will enjoy it, because here's the thing. You know, I got to go through this a lot with Michigan State for a while, and especially those years where Michigan State had like 6 years in football where they won 3 Big Ten titles in a 3-year span where they won 36 games. And the basketball team in some of those years was ranked number 1 at times. I mean, it was almost sensory overload for MSU fans, because it was just like they couldn't handle 2 things at once. And it was all so good, or it was all so bad, or whatever it was. There was lots of emotions. And Michigan State and Illinois has some of this. Like, Illinois to me is a basketball school, but there are more tenets of football, people caring about football if they were good, than other places. Like, it's not Indiana in that sense. Michigan State is truly a place that's pretty 50-50. and I think that is that is a cool thing for that fan base, because they truly can turn a page when a football season goes wrong. Like, to have both going,
Yeah.
then when one doesn't have a year you like, you can just turn the page, and it's like, okay, we got something else. Whereas if you're at Notre Dame and you have a bad 2 months in the football season, it's 10 months again before you can feel your soul again, right? Like, that's it. They don't care about hoops, even if they're good. So I think, yeah, I think it's pretty cool. I think I'm curious to see this Illinois basketball roster. Like, there's a lot of changes, a lot of new pieces, a really interesting talent, and then how it all comes together. I'm curious to watch. But yeah, no, I think these are the years to embrace. And if you're covering it, it's a hell of a lot better than the alternative.
Well said. Well said. Graham Couch, Lansing State Journal. Appreciate the time as always, man.
Anytime. Thanks for having me, Jeremy.